Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our friends all over the world joining us today. Some might agree that the issue of pervasive and systemic racism in society represents the utmost failure of our species. Centuries and centuries of regarding one racial group being in any way superior or inferior to another racial group, justifying colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. And yet here we are in 2020, despite everything we've managed to accomplish in the arts and the sciences and philosophy. Racial violence, racial injustice, and racial inequity continue to tear our society apart. We need to understand our privileges. We need to educate ourselves about the history of racism, work to change our internalized racism, and oppose racism when we see it. This is why we convene here today. And I'm very lucky to have very different, yet equally extraordinary panelists with me today. Two very dear friends whom I had the privilege of meeting exactly 10 years ago, in fact. Dr. Fritjof Capra, one of the world's most renowned systems theorists, a deep ecologist, a prolific author, founding director of the Center for Equal Literacy in Berkeley, California, a faculty member at Schumacher College, and the creator of the infamous Capra course, which has been training systems thinkers all over the world. And Danny Tawiah, originally from Ghana, educated in the UK, formerly a longtime global executive at Nike, and today, in addition to being a very vocal advocate for racial justice in corporate America, also leads Mandalah's activities out of Portland, Oregon. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to share this virtual stage with you. In fact, I couldn't think of a more auspicious moment for us to be talking about systemic racism and racial justice. Until a few days ago, we were on our way to having a textbook racist leading the so-called free world for another 4 years. And what we have instead is the first ever woman of color and of South Asian descent as Vice President of the United States of America. So let me start by asking, how are you? And how are you feeling about this recent turn of events?
Yeah. Hello, Lorenzo. Hello, Danny. It's very nice to see you again. It's a great pleasure and indeed a great honor for me to participate in this conversation. This is something I have never done. I've had lots of, panel discussions and seminars and lectures, but never about systemic racism. So I really look forward to that. And of course, I'm overjoyed about the recent political events in the United States. We celebrated the whole weekend, and it felt like waking up from a 4-year nightmare, that we can really breathe again now, to use this famous phrase, and looking forward to a positive future. And Danny, special hello to you. We have actually never met in person physically, but I hope we will so soon. And I really treasure our conversations and hope that we'll have many more.
Likewise. And again, thank you for the warm welcome. Lorenzo, as always, it's an absolute pleasure. I think what's happening now, today, the last few weeks has been absolutely incredible, clearly for all. It's nerve-wracking, if I'm being honest. Really nerve-wracking. But good prevailed. I think what it says something about the world we live in. It certainly says something about the United States of America. What I'm interested in, however, is where we go from here. What happens from here on out. And so whilst I'm a big fan of, seeing the way that people have turned out and have made their voices heard, I think that's just the beginning of the conversation. And so this dialogue, these moments, these situations where we allow ourselves the time and the opportunity to continue questioning and asking and probing, I think is going to be more and more critical as we evolve, both as a society and as a human race. And so I personally, I'm obviously very excited by it. The stress levels are way down now, for sure. It was touch and go for a few days, but I am very excited about us getting together and having this dialogue. And for me, the outcome I'm hoping for is that, if nothing at all, there's going to be some, bite-sized pieces of useful information that we can transfer over to those that are listening and watching. Yeah. So excited.
I agree, Danny, that the work is only beginning, and there's this very well-known issue of the center versus the left in the Democratic Party. I'm a big Bernie Sanders fan and a big fan of AOC and her colleagues. And we will have to see how we get, these policies into into the actual government and legislatures. But I did notice, I'm sure you noticed too, that among the priorities of the Biden-Harris transition team, after obviously the COVID pandemic, is the fight against systemic racism. This is right up there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
sure.
great. It's great.
And before we dive any further into the actual topic, I think it's important that we preface our exchange with where each of us sees ourselves in this discussion. Admittedly, as a person born into white privilege, I know there's a lot more that I don't know about racism than there is about what I do know. So I'm here to learn. I'm here to facilitate a discussion that I feel I have a moral obligation to be part of. Being a citizen of Brazil, where racism is so deeply, so undeniably rooted in our political systems, our schools, our companies, our families, and society at large. In fact, I feel provoked by what Martin Luther King once said, which is, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And systemic racism, to me, it's an existential threat. And so today, I choose not to be silent about it. And with that, I invite Fritjof and Dani, if you want to offer your perspectives on where you see yourselves in these conversations as well.
Yeah. Well, I feel very much like you, Lourenço, because I'm also in the same white privileged position in a different cultural environment, but similar. So my personal position here and what I bring personally is two experiences of racism. One of anti-Semitism in Austria, where I grew up after World War II, and in a white privileged, in a non-Jewish privileged position, but shocked by the anti-Semitism, which is a form of racism. And then in the 1960s, I moved to California and had a very dramatic experience of racism in California. Let me just tell you a little story. I think it was in 1969, the police in San Francisco shot an unarmed Black youth in a record store, I believe. And this was one of the first of these many, many incidences that we have now witnessed. And so my wife and I were absolutely shocked and disturbed by this event. And we went to the boy's funeral. And we thought that a large number of similarly disturbed white people would be there. And there was indeed a very large number, but there was only one other white couple. Everybody else was African American. There was a big presentation by the Black Panthers, who were quite fearsome, in their black leather with guns, berets, and everything. And so we were quite scared, to tell you the truth, to be in this environment as practically the only white people. So I asked one of these guards of the Black Panther whether it was okay for us to, attend the funeral. And he looked straight at me and he said, "You're welcome, brother, you're welcome." So I will never forget that. And that was my first experience of, this contrast between racism and the human reality. Mm. And I should add that intellectually, I bring to this conversation a systemic perspective, which is something I've worked on most of my professional life, which means putting the issue of racism into a broader context and showing how it is related to many other issues. That's what I bring in terms of thoughts.
Great story. There's lots of stories like that, I'm sure we could probably do a whole session just on those stories. Obviously for me, as a Black man, clearly, having had sort of a pretty global series of experiences, born in Ghana, raised in the UK, spent almost a decade in Holland, and then subsequently over here in the US. And in that time, the notion of racism has always been around. If you ask anyone in the Black community, they'll tell you it's not new for the Black community to experience racism. And so what's new about it is the rest of the world sort of catching up to what we've been experiencing. For me personally, I have had some, I consider them to be traumatizing experiences, if I'm being really brutally honest. And they were tied to corporate America. And it's, you know, having had a highly successful career for over 13 years, and then sort of watch and see how race becomes a narrative that isn't used for the greater good, but rather it's used in a sort of destructive manner. It's really hard for me to not have a voice in this, given my experiences, both on the brand and the corporate side, but also as a Black man and as a father of two young Black men. And so for me, it's personal. There's a wealth of knowledge and experience I have. My goal is to share that knowledge and experience with the hope of, you know, being able to touch one person to look at it differently. You know, I always tell people racism isn't the sharp object of racism. When people talk about racism, they often try and compartmentalize it. Oh, it's the guy with the swastika on his forehead, or it's the KKK. And those are very crude, blunt objects when it comes to racism. That's not that. Yes, of course, we need to solve for those too. But what I'm really interested in, that's why I'm of course excited about this conversation, is what we talked about before, the subtleties of, you know, I'm going to use the term unconscious bias here, because I think the most damaging form of racism lives in that realm of unconscious bias. And it reveals itself in so many different ways. And those subtleties are undetected, you know, or left undetected over time, can be really traumatizing and really damaging. And so
and they exist even with the best intentions in all of us.
Absolutely.
Because the racist ideas have been developed and refined to such an extent over centuries that they're deep in our psyche, no matter what our intentions are. That's
what's exactly, and I would say it's also in the Black community. You know, there's this term, you know, the imposter syndrome, where you grow up never believing you're good enough, or the society has told you. And so you almost have to prove to yourself through your own experiences that you're worthy, that you're capable, that you are good enough. That's intrinsic in the community, in the Black community. So we've also got work to do in terms of breaking that chain and realizing that racism hasn't just affected the Black community literally, but it's affected everybody in some shape or form. And so this is a great reset. And I think that the sort of the collective awakening of the rest of the world around racism and the fact that it exists gives us a great platform right now to try and, you know, bring some constructive solutions to the foreground that we can apply. Because I don't think we've ever had a stage or a forum or an audience that's willing to have this conversation ever. This is probably the first time, certainly in my lifetime, that I've seen it.
Great. So
well, let me add to this that we met on screen in another dialogue that Lourenço organized, and this was about my own work about what I call the systems view of life, systemic thinking, and a new conception of life that has emerged in science. And Danny came as one of the sort of respondents in this dialogue, and he asked me, how do you apply systemic thinking to racism? And it really caught me totally unprepared, although I had been aware of racism, sometimes acutely so, especially recently, of course. I had never studied it systematically. And so in preparation for this, and I suggested then, I said, I can't answer it, but let's have a dialogue about it, you know, sometime in the future. Yeah. And in preparation for that, I did my homework and educated myself. And I want to share with our viewers 3 books that I read.
So let me ask you, let me kick this part off by asking you a question that will help us get to the systemic vision. So many discussions around racism today, they're rooted in current events, isolated episodes of racism that recur, you know, time after time, year after year, decade after decade, without any perceived and sustained progress on the issue. In fact, racial progress is always followed by the progression of racism. Look at the abolition of slavery in 1865, followed by the establishment of the racist policies of Jim Crow. Then you had the outline of Jim Crow in 64, followed by the racist policies in the late 20th century. Then you had Barack Obama embodying racial progress, followed by Donald Trump embodying progressive racism. So my question to you, may this vicious cycle be a result of our inability to understand racism from a systems perspective, Fritjof?
Yes, I think so. And before I go into it, let me tell you that one of the books I read is a 500-volume book by Ibram Kendi called Stamped from the Beginning. The subtitle is The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, and that's what it really is. And it's a really eye-opening book. Kendi also published a more recent book, How to Become an Anti-Racist, and it's a very articulate, concise analysis, crystal clear about the nature and origin of racism. And finally, I read the book that just came out called Black Fatigue, and the subtitle says it all, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit by Mary Frances Winters. This was a difficult book for me to read because it had such a high emotional impact. I had to stop several times. I was just overwhelmed. And I'm not going to talk about this today because we have a first-hand account by Danny here. But this was also, very eye-opening to me. So what I learned, among many things from these books, is that racism has always been driven by economic, political, or cultural self-interest. So you have a certain group that has a self-interest, and that is then supported because of the political power of that group, that is supported by discriminatory policies. And these policies are then justified by racist ideas. So what Kendi says especially is the racist ideas do not come first. They come in service of justifying discrimination. And so when I read that, I thought then, how is this possible? How can one group consider themselves inherently superior to another group? And I believe from a systems point of view, when you go deep down into this question, you encounter what is often called the human condition, which is the fact that we are biological beings, but we are also conscious beings capable of forming abstract ideas which may contradict the biological reality. That's part of the human nature, human condition. And this is the case with racism, because race is not a biological reality. It is not a meaningful scientific category. We know today that genetically, all human beings are more than 99.9% the same. In other words, race is a genetic mirage. However, race is a very powerful social construct and has been used as a social construct to justify, as you mentioned, Lorenzo, imperialism, colonialism, and slavery for centuries. And let me just give you a couple of examples how this was done. In the West, it goes way back to ancient Greece, where Aristotle developed a climate theory of racism. So for Aristotle, the superior race, of course, were the Greeks. And they were superior because they lived in the mild Mediterranean climate. And so as you went either north to colder climates or south to warmer and hotter climates, the races became progressively inferior. Now, Aristotle, of course, had a huge influence on European and on Islamic thinkers during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And so this climate theory was taken over by others in Europe and in North Africa, in the Islamic world, to justify slavery. Now, another curious theory was developed in the early history of the Americas by the American Puritans, who used the Bible to construct a racist justification for slavery. actually they had several of these models, but one of them, which is particularly grotesque, is that when they encountered Native Americans early on, who were not mentioned in the Bible, they said, well, these people may have descended from a different Adam. And then they brought this to Europe, and the Europeans applied it to Africans and said, oh, well, the Black Africans also descended from a different Adam. Now, of course, from the modern scientific point of view, this is absolutely grotesque, because we know today that we all descended from Africa, right? We all came out of Africa. So to say that Africans come from a different Adam, they are our Adam, if you wish. They are the ancestors. And you see that this was then developed further. And one of the really shocking experiences in reading Candy's history of racist ideas was to realize that virtually all of Europe and America's leading intellectuals had racist ideas. And this goes from Kant and Voltaire to Linnaeus, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, the great heroes of the Enlightenment. When you read what they say about slavery or about African peoples, it's absolutely shocking. I mean, it's appalling. So these ideas were refined and perpetuated, and this is why we have such problems dealing with them psychologically. So what we need to do is to recognize the discriminatory policies that lie at the origin of racist ideas. And rather than blaming groups of people, we need to blame the policies and the inequity and discrimination. I think that's the main message that I learned.
That's great. As a historical, I mean, as a retrospective, I think in order to understand how we got here today, we need to understand where this all began,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
all the different incoherences that we've been sustaining across time and across generations. So Danny, we can see how racism, it's been a scar on the human experiment for longer than we can all appreciate. I think the fact that most people don't even know this, nor are willing to talk about it, is the actual elephant in the room, isn't it?
Right.
So
yeah, exactly.
Can you help us get a perspective on how racism manifests in the systems intrinsic to modern life?
You know, I think, well, first of what you said earlier, Lorenzo, makes so much sense. The notion of privilege is something that I think is a good discussion to have, because it's all rooted in that. I think the experiences, certainly for those of us that have experienced it, a lot of the time, to the point earlier you made, it's not deliberate. You know, no one's going out of their way to overtly be racist. Most people don't even realize they have these tendencies. It's not because, to, you know, Fritjof's point, it's a very subtle, gradual indoctrination that happens over time. To the point where you don't see that, you know, it's that whole notion of, if you want to kill a frog, you boil it, you know, 1 degree at a time and it won't know it's dying. It's sort of that analogy. And I think that subtlety is real. What I would love your viewers to sort of start thinking about is, oftentimes you can feel that it's wrong if you're experiencing, or if you're consuming it, or if you're seeing somebody else go through this experience. What I find, especially now, to be a really great step forward is more people are pushing back on it. I always tell people, racism for me isn't dealt with when I'm in the room. It's not what people say about me when I'm around as a Black man. It's what they say when I'm not around. You know, is what they say around dinner tables, is what they say about their racist grandfather at that Christmas that, you know, people sort of laugh off in the corner. Those are all tiny, tiny bite-sized examples of racism that compounds into the effects that we're seeing. And it's psychological, and it has a really damaging effect, right? It's a knock-on effect, because especially here in the US, where you don't, you know, growing up in London and Europe, somehow racism is obviously in Europe, we know that, but there is a certain amount of tolerance that I don't necessarily feel here in the US. You know, I lived with my Moroccan friends, Nigerian friends, you know, Hispanic friends, Brazilian friends, all in the same neighborhood. We all love football. What brought us together was sport. Sport was the unifier. And so we all knew that we were immigrants to some extent. We all knew that we all came from somewhere else other than where we were. That concept is missing here in the US, which blows my mind because the entire nation is built off of that premise. So the miseducation that's happened, I think, across this nation is one that really needs to be looked at, because if you don't teach the history in the right way, you end up with a lot of people not understanding why we are where we are today. So, you know, it's damaging. I think there are ways, and I love this conversation. I think a lot of this is to do with systems, it's to do with self-awareness, it's also to do with acknowledgement. Because for me, if privilege can't acknowledge that it has privilege and that these systems, these issues actually exist, I think it's hard to then move beyond the dialogue. It's hard to then have a two-way dialogue that can move the narrative forward. And so what I always tell people, especially now, is begin with just simple acknowledgement. Just acknowledge that the privilege is there. You don't have to apologize for it. You don't owe anyone any explanation. It is what it is. You're fortunate, but acknowledge it. Because that acknowledgement allows permission for the dialogue to happen, you know. And
Danny, what about doing this formally with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission modeled after the South African model? Wouldn't this be great?
I think it would be incredible. I think it's exactly something like that this nation, certainly here in the US, because remember, and if as a collective group, you don't stand up and say, yes, this was wrong, this is still wrong, and we are committed to fixing it or moving it for the greater good of humanity, I think we're going to sort of be swimming around the dialogue for a long time. It has to start. I think the Truth and Reconciliation approach is exactly where we need to start, because you're dealing with fundamentally a human conversation. So it needs to start at the human level.
And it could start with a formal apology by the president for slavery, which we have never had. And
that would be a great place to start.
Danny, about acknowledging, I think one can only acknowledge that which one knows is actually happening or is a reality. And I think we turn a blind eye to many things. You know, we see what we want to see, and we also don't see what we cannot see, right? And so in the conversations leading up to this webinar today, we talked a little bit about how systemic racism is ingrained, it's inoculated in college athletics, in professional sports, in corporate America, obviously in the criminal justice system, housing, food security, public health, loan practices of banks. Can you help us kind of just understand the depth and magnitude of systemic racism in these institutions that are very public, that are very mainstream, but that perhaps we don't have a critical eye to the extent that we should?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's deep. I mean, it's far, it's wide, it's extensive, and it's relentless. I mean, there's no way of describing it. It's all consuming. It's everywhere, guys. Like, that's what I'm trying to help people understand. Sometimes I think most of the time it's actually subconscious. And I think that's where we are now, which for me is even more dangerous. Because it's one thing to say, you know, to be able to point at somebody and go, that person there has racist tendencies or is displaying those behaviors. At least then you know who your enemy is in that regard. This type of racism is very scary because you don't see it unless you cross the line. It's only if you push that individual to a point where you actually see that they have those tendencies. Sure. So it is hard to pinpoint, but it is relentless, and it is absolutely evasive. To your point,
may I ask you, Danny, how was your experience at Nike? You were very high up at Nike, and Nike, of course, has tons of Black athletes as spokespeople. So it seems from the outside that Nike is a model.
No, Nike is a brand. Nike is a corporation, like all the other corporations. I learned the hard way. I learned the hard way, and I learned through, you know, they're Karens, I call them. You know, we've all seen the analogies of the Karens. It's that, you know, these in this case, white women that have never had a Black boss. They've never had someone like me be their leader, and it didn't. For some of them, it didn't sit well. They needed to find a way to put me in my place, and they did that very publicly. And in the end, it forced me to take a different career path, not by choice, but because they had decided that they weren't happy with the fact that this man was their boss. That's like a tiny example of what racism looks like. I mean, you guys see stuff on social media. You see sort of some of the basic, just normal behaviors that any human being would expect to not have to, deal with or challenge or be forced to sort of to fight against. It's there. It's happening all around us. What I'm excited to see, and I love when this happens, is when groups that you don't expect speak out. And I see it all the time. We've all got our own stereotypes. So I'm sure with my own unconscious bias, there's a lot of assumptions I'm making about my right friends and colleagues about the position they take. And some of them have actually been a lot more overtly aggressive about the conversation than I have, which has always felt amazing to me. But to the question you asked earlier, yeah, I mean, it's everywhere, guys. It's 24 hours a day. And it's relentless. The Black community have just learned to live with it. We've just learned to navigate our lives around it, knowing that it was always around us. The piece for me personally that I'm choosing not to do is pander. Because even for me, becoming a vice president at Nike at 40, I mean, what a story, right? Lourenço was part of my journey towards that. And so when I got up there, I was like, wow, look, this brand is celebrating my story of sort of, working hard, pushing myself, and wanting better, wanting to break the chain, of poverty and what have you. But it wasn't the case. It was just a narrative that suited them in the moment. When it didn't suit them anymore, they evolved it and it became me too. It became.
Were you an athlete also, Danny? Were you an athlete?
I wish. I'd like to say yes, but not really. Only a little bit. But I've always loved sport. Sport, marketing, and design have sort of been the trifecta of my career overall. And so I've always been around it. So yeah, it's definitely something that is, as I said, 365. But the fact that, again, we're talking about it and people are continuously challenging, I think is a really great step forward.
So, Danny, in some way, what you went through at Nike kind of propelled you into being in a position where you're advising CEOs across the board on how to understand Black Lives Matter, how to understand racial justice within corporate America. There are a lot of leaders that are watching us today from across the world. How do you advise leaders so that they can pay credence to this agenda and make sure that they're addressing it in the most coherent and consistent way possible?
Thank you for the opportunity to even share this with the viewers. For me, it's, if you're let's go back and think of it through the lens of a CEO, somebody who's in, at the corporate exec level. You've got your problems are a lot, in that you probably got a very diverse group of people you have to manage. Not all of them necessarily skew Black Lives Matter. You're going to have people from different perspectives. My advice to a lot of CEOs and CMOs and leaders of corporations is you have to humanize your conversation with your organization. You have to become human in that moment. Back to acknowledgement, because if you got a business to run, that business still needs to operate with people that sit on both sides of the aisle. So if you can't reach beyond that and make it bipartisan, you cannot solve the problem. It will actually impact your bottom line. And so my first advice to CEOs is you have to be human. You're speaking to human beings. Approach the conversation with a human perspective and think to yourself, what would I want to hear from my leader if I was in those shoes? And act accordingly. The other one I would say is be accountable. If you put up, there's so many strategic imperatives and priorities that brands are now throwing around that won't go anywhere. I think that when brands make these statements about, helping change the narrative, that we have to hold them accountable. We have to, because by only doing that will the change happen. The forced environment of the working environment is a forced environment. Racism it's not discussed. It's just there. It has its own frequency and it's just there all the time. But since it's a forced environment, it means you can create systems that can equalize a level playing field, I think. But it has to start with the company wanting to apply those systems.
This fits very much with the systems view of companies. I have spent many years in discussion with organizational theorists to answer the question, is a human organization a living system? And if so, why and how? And it turns out that the answer to this question is yes and no, because every human organization has a dual nature. It is a social institution designed for a particular purpose. That's the official structure. And it is also a community of people who interact with one another, who form friendships and alliances. And when you want your company to be alive, that is to be flexible, creative, able to respond to unusual circumstances, it's the human part that counts. It's what theorists today call communities of practice. These communities form spontaneously within the organization, and a CEO who recognizes them and empowers them will have a living company. And so it's very interesting from the angle of racism to have a living company to bring, as I say, bring life into organization. You say you also have to humanize it, which I think includes an ethical dimension.
Absolutely.
And so that really fits well with the systems view.
Yeah, it's definitely the I think that's the first step in sort of addressing the issue. And then I think the other one is, realizing there's no shortcuts here. It's a long-term game. This is, you're talking about generations and centuries of conditioning and, miseducation that we're trying to sort of unravel. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require discipline and focus, and in order to change minds. What I find really interesting, especially now, is there's a really great sort of analogy I always make for trying to help people understand it. And this works in particular for men. I always sort of think of sexism, right? The concept. Just like racism, unless you're experiencing it, you can have it. There's a certain amount of level of empathy that you can get to, and then unless you're experiencing it, you just can't go beyond that. So at that point, you need to listen. And I always tell people, my wife reminds me all the time of things that I do that she's like, you do realize this could be misinterpreted as sexism. I think racism is sort of in the same space, in that if you're not experiencing it, if it's not your day to day, then it's not front and center. And if it's not front and center, it means that and it doesn't mean that you don't want to be part of the solution. It just means it's not front and center. You're not necessarily recognizing those moments when they're presented to you. And so I think that for me is an area that I'm really sort of keen on. I don't know what the answer is, but it's an area I'm keen on, because given that it's all the time and we're all around it all the time, my question is, how can I help my friends start to become sort of have sharper eyes towards this and be able to speak up in a way that can be of benefit to the conversation? Because those things will add up.
I think that's a really good parallel between racism and sexism. I remember when I became a feminist in the 1970s, after reading, Germaine Greer and Betty Friedan, and especially Adrienne Rich, the book of Woman Born, this was so powerful for me that I had never realized how deeply patriarchal language, culture, science, religion, and so on had penetrated into our culture. And so from that time on, I just saw patriarchal, sexist behavior everywhere, every day, everywhere. And I think we need to get to this point with racism. That's what Kendi calls being an anti-racist. Once you're an anti-racist, you see it everywhere. You may not be able to do something all the time. You may not have the force or the energy to do something all the time, but at least you see it all the time.
Yeah, sure. And then at that point, people can have a choice, right? If you're seeing it, then you have a choice. Do I want to lend my voice to it? Do I want to push against it? Or do I simply want to live my life as normal? You have a choice, which I think for me, again, is a step in the right direction.
Gentlemen, I want to take this moment, this opportunity to take our first question from a very, very special guest, a Brazilian professor from Dartmouth College, professor of physics and astronomy, Marcelo Glazer. Will be asking a question now. He's one of the world's most respected physicists and astronomers. He was the recipient of the Templeton Prize, for those who are not familiar with it. It recognizes groundbreaking work of people that are working at the intersection of science and religion. Mother Teresa was the first recipient. Since then, Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama were recipients. And in 2019, Brazil had the privilege of having Marcelo represent us by being the recipient of this prize. So Marcelo, welcome to our conversation. The mic is with you.
Thank you. I feel like an intruder. I've been listening and mesmerized by what you guys have been saying. It's very inspiring. And honestly, I wasn't prepared. Lourenço just said that to me last night or afternoon. And one question that I have, which is really a question that bothers me, and I bet it bothers a lot of you all, which is the following. If you look to most of the people that are listening to this today, and to most of the people that align with, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a huge self-selection process going on. And what you see in the United States and in many other countries, but let's focus on here right now, is this huge polarization where the others will not listen or want to listen to this message. So the question, which is not an easy one, I know, is how do you break through? How do you speak to those who do not want, in principle, to listen to you? Because of why I would trace this down to literally to tribal allegiance. You know, there are to me, one of the worst problems of humanity right now is one of the best things that we had 10,000 years ago, 20, 50,000 years ago, which was tribalism. And to get through is extremely complicated. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on this very important issue, you know, so that the conversation can really reach those who do not want to listen to it.
Yeah. I don't have an answer, and I hope either Danny or Lourenço do, because, you know, to put my cards on the table, my personality is such that I hate antagonism, you know. I don't enjoy being in an antagonistic environment. And so in my professional life, when I was fighting for, you know, social change and the environmental movement and, you know, all kinds of things, both in science and in society, I would always choose environments, communities, audiences who were sort of halfway with me, but still had a lot of doubts, a lot of uncertainties, and I could really help them by clarifying things with my science background. But I was sometimes invited to combative, you know, panel discussions with people who were really on the other side, and I always turned them down. I mean, I don't thrive in this environment. So I know how important it is, but I'm sorry that this is not my thing. So I hope Danny can.
Maybe I can go out. Maybe I can shed a different perspective in it. It's a great question, by the way, and it's great to meet you, Marcelo. It's
Likewise.
I'm going to talk as if this is a marketing campaign. I'm running a Nike marketing campaign, and the product is racism. You have different audiences, right? The way I sort of look at it is there are different stages of enlightenment. There are some people who are waking up to the fact that, holy crap, racism has been around me all my life and I'm a great person, but I never saw it. I thought it was this thing that sort of just got discussed about. There are other people who are saying, no, this is my stance, this is my position, I'm not moving. And there are others that are saying, I can't believe the world is this way. How can I help be part of the change? Each one of those audiences requires a different response in order to evolve it. Some of them need less aggression. There's some people that are closer to your truth, and there's some people that are further away from your truth. For me, where I would focus my energy is the extreme version, what you're just describing, those that simply don't want to listen. In that instance, honestly, it goes back to something that the professor said earlier on, which is, that it's to do with your bottom line. It becomes about, you know, your social standing. It becomes about, because think about why we're having this conversation about racism. It's because there are subset groups that feel underserved. Well, how are you being underserved? What are you missing from your world that you feel has been taken away from you by virtue of having the Black community be part of society? Let's understand that, and then let's figure out if that can be solved. Because it's only then can you move people past that notion of hatred, or that notion that somehow the world is taking something from them. You have to first figure out what the underlying root is. And so for me, the dialogue and the conversation around this, I can have this dialogue with anybody. I don't particularly like antagonistic conversations either, but I understand that there are different audiences. And so, you know, this is a conversation about racism, and yet it's a very constructive, productive, useful dialogue we're having. Equally, you could be in another webinar where, you know, they're talking over each other because their passions are rising, and they're not able to sort of take a step back and actually understand that this is a two-way dialogue, and understand that we're all at different stages of sort of acknowledgement, if you will. So, you know, long story long, I think that you know, it's this dialogue, man. It's us getting on a conversation, it's having conversations with those that are struggling to understand why we're talking about racism, and helping them understand. It's reading those amazing books that has been suggested, and getting to the roots of why we're here. Most of the especially generational, if you think about it, if you're born into racism, you're born into it. It's like being in the Matrix. You don't know any different. If all you've grown up is privilege with no access to other people of culture that you can interact with, that can actually contradict the conditioning would have happened over years, it is challenging. So I think it's understand that your audiences are different. Everybody's different at different stages of realization and enlightenment around race. And continue to have the dialogue that's contextually right for those audiences. You know, if I've got a friend a friend of mine said to me the other day, she said, you know, gosh, she's very progressive, and she said, you helped me understand. Even I didn't realize I had these sort of unconscious biases. So she went and she read some of the books, and she's like, holy crap, this is the perspective that I never knew I had. That changed her perspective. And she says, I'm not doing enough. I keep waiting for somebody to hand me the solution. And I said, well, you are the solution. She said, what could I do? I said, you can mentor somebody for an hour a week. Pick one young Black man or woman that's in the space you happen to be an expert in, and invest a piece of your time. You imagine 1 million people doing that. The effects of that is a very positive thing, but it starts with acknowledgement. It starts with knowing where you are in terms of, you know, your level of enlightenment, and then making sure the dialogue that you're having in that in that construct is useful. Does that sort of answer it? Sorry, I sort of went about it a long way around. Apologies.
Yeah,
Just
no, I wasn't expecting a final answer from anyone, because I know it's an extremely complex question, but I wonder if perhaps a starting point, I think there are possibly two starting points. One of them is to start the conversation with the things that we have in common, because we're all humans. You know, you mentioned that, Dan. You said, you know, you're talking to humans, right? And as humans, we share a lot of stuff from the start, and things that tend to be kind of forgotten when you focus on what we do not have in common. But, you know, the fundamental aspirations of humans are very similar. And as long as both sides are led to understand this, the conversation becomes more possible and perhaps less antagonic. That's just one thing I'm throwing in. The other one, because I know we don't have a lot of time, the other one is education. We have to change the narrative of education in the schools all the way from the beginning. You know, the way the history of civilization is told is already an amplifier of precisely the questions that we're raising here today, right? The way it's told, it's despicable. And you all probably are aware of Trump complaining recently of the way the history of the United States is being untold in the schools, because it's actually being told, beginning to be told the right way, right? So meaning, you know, these guys were raised, you know, Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, et cetera. So I think education is absolutely essential, because it has a huge universal reach.
Yeah.
It's going to talk to all kids everywhere, unless, the schools are, limiting what they can be,
Yeah.
And it goes hand in hand with consciousness levels, right? Education and consciousness levels, the extent to which someone is enlightened on these issues really depends on the education that they've received. And I would bring even a very rational and very primitive lens to this question, because I work from the premise that everyone wants to live, love, and leave a legacy, even if it's at a subconscious level. So if people are racist, it's because subconsciously or consciously, they feel it's in their best interest to do so. But if we can change the narrative and change the math and show them that no, in effect, being racist, it creates a negative outcome for everyone, including yourself, then people rationally will say, well, then it's better for me to foster respect, compassion, conviviality. For me, there's a very striking analogy between racism and climate change, because they're both existential threats. And people only change their behaviors regarding the environment when they realize that if they don't, the collective outcome for everybody will be negative, right? So if they see themselves as part of the problem and the solution, then perhaps they kind of flip the switch inside them and realize that it's in their best interest to change their habits and decondition their mind.
That's a great one. I love that. It's funny because it was a CEO I was given some consulting work to, and you realize that the CEO was struggling with how to get, because this is how he looked at it. He said to himself, look, I have a business. The world is telling me that culturally I have to catch up, right? As far as my diverse pool of talent is concerned. But he's sitting there going, as a CEO, my business is functioning really well right now, right? I'm cash flow positive. I have great teams. The society's telling me to make these changes. What is in it for me from a CEO standpoint? And you help them understand that diversity actually can help your bottom line. Like having a diverse, rich workforce is actually a positive cash. It's strategically the right thing to do. It's going to affect your bottom line in a positive way. And you suddenly realize the motivation changes. So because they can now see the value, but to simply ask the CEO to make the changes because the world wants to see those changes, as much as they would love to make those changes, they've got shareholders that they have to, they sort of adhere to. So they tend to come at it through the lens of the bottom line and where it goes. And if you can wrap a business rationale around the value of diversity in the workforce, I find that you tend to get a lot more responses, a lot more of a positive, proactive response versus do it because it's the right thing to do. I think it's too much to ask of any CEO.
This is also completely consistent with a systemic perspective, because diversity is one of the great principles of ecology and principles of life, as can be seen, for example, in agroecology, or also called regenerative agriculture, where the great diversity produces crops that are much more resistant to climate change than the monocultures produced by industrial agriculture. Then we also want to come back to what you said about mentoring. Yes,
Fritjof, just 1 second. I'm conscious that Marcelo has a hard stop at the hour because he has another commitment. So I did want to thank Marcelo for his question. Thank you for chiming in.
I'm really sorry, guys, about this.
You.
But I wasn't prepared. But
Marcelo, nice to meet you.
Great
nice
to meet you.
Fritjof, I read your book when I was 18 years old, and it was a very impactful book in my
great.
formative years. So, all right. See you. Bye, guys.
See you tomorrow, Marcelo. Take care.
Oh, yeah.
So I wanted to come back, Danny, what you said about mentoring. It reminded me of a little anecdote that was very powerful for me. When my daughter went to elementary school many, many years ago, I picked her up. I was very involved in the school. And so there was a young Black boy, maybe 8 years old, something like this, who had a temper tantrum. And he was just full of rage, and he was flailing around, and the teachers didn't know how to handle it. And it was just an awful scene. And he had a jacket that he threw on the floor. And then I picked up the jacket and I said, look, you lost your jacket. And then he looked at me and he said, can I go home with you?
Wow.
I mean, this was such a powerful experience. It still brings tears to my eyes when I tell the story. And it shows the power of mentoring. It doesn't take much, you know? It doesn't take much. All I did was picking up a jacket. That was all.
And that's, I love your stories. I love your stories because they're perfect examples of what I mean. It's, we can all do something towards this. This isn't, you know, I tell people, the racism really is rooted in the white community, and it needs to be, there needs to be some self-reflection that needs to happen here. And it has to be a collective decision to change it, because it's, that's where the root of the issue is. I know it's tied to classism. We know it's tied to, there's the wealth gap issues that we see around us. We know all of those things, but the idea that people are waiting for the answer, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have to overcome, is helping people understand that you are the change. You know, 2 hours a week, to your point, you know, about help, you know, mentoring this child by, in this case, just giving him a jacket. The idea that you're going to help this young man or woman, there is some positives that come back to you, which is you're going to learn a bit more. If you weren't up to speed on Black culture, well, there you go. There'll be someone here that you can hopefully learn from and grow with. But more importantly, you're going to make a difference in that person's life. If that's done at scale, that is very valuable. So there is things we can do as a society, you know, overall. It takes every one of us to take a little piece of the problem and provide a proactive solution, and not wait to be given the answers, because there isn't anyone out there that's going to come give you this. It's about each individual figuring out what they can do to be part of the change.
And that's a beautiful segue into a question that I want to ask Fritjof, which has to do with what Ibram Kendi argues about that there's no neutrality in the racism struggle, right? That the opposite of racist is not racist, but anti-racist. So I'd like to ask you what this means from the perspective of how we respond to systemic racism, which is the topic that we're on now.
Yeah, well, this is one of the big lessons I also learned from Kendi's book. And what he says is, when people say, oh, I'm not a racist, or, you know, I am colorblind, color doesn't exist for me, he shows that this just means that they don't recognize racism. And so ultimately, the statement, I'm not a racist, is a racist statement. So what he says then is the opposite of being a racist is being an anti-racist, which means locating the roots of discrimination in power and politics rather than in a certain group of people. And interestingly, he distinguishes two kinds of racist ideas. The one he calls segregationist, which is the racist idea that one race is inherently inferior to another and will always remain so. There's no way, because it's a biological given. That's the extreme form. The other one, which is also racist, he calls assimilationist, which says that the inferiority may be due to circumstances and it can be overcome. And to overcome it, the inferior group needs to behave as much as possible like the superior group and assimilate as much as possible. So again, it's racist because it locates the inferiority in a group of people rather than in the politics and in power. And finally, what I also learned is that because of the location of racism in discriminatory politics and power, there, as Danny already mentioned, there are many, many kinds of racism. So Kendi points out there's what he calls biological racism, there's cultural racism, there's what he calls colorist racism, that, you know, people of lighter skin within the ethnic community are perceived as being somehow superior. And then there are, as Danny also pointed out, there are these various intersections. Now we talk about intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. So there's gender racism, there's queer racism, and various other forms. So it's a very, very complex phenomenon.
Absolutely.
Now, if the objective is to be anti-racist, how does one actually get there? Kendi tells us that he says that the heartbeat of racism is denial, and the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. How does that resonate with you, Danny?
I think he's spot on. I mean, I think silence is complicit. I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how people deal with it behind closed doors. Silence makes you complicit. It's having the sort of the knowledge. I think there's a lot of knowledge, and it's having the knowledge, and then it's having the ability to stand up and actually re-educate the people around you who have these beliefs. But like anything else, when it's comfortable, we're all guilty of it to some extent. If you were to take this this conversation out of the race context, I'm sure I would be guilty of many situations that I've just sort of bypassed without even factoring in that I could have made a difference in this situation, or perhaps I should have approached it differently. We all, if it's not in our sort of front of mind, or we're not actually experiencing it, humans tend to not, make it a priority, or at least I'm generalizing. It's the equivalent of people having dinner whilst watching the news. Like that always it's like you're watching news as a form of entertainment. Yet these are war. They're showing people dying and suffering.
Sure.
Yet we're so desensitized from it that we can continue enjoying this beautiful meal without realizing those are humans on the other side of the world suffering. So, and that obviously that's an extreme version, but it's that the fact that we can, as humans, we can really detach ourselves from the issues. And that's why, as long as you have this ability to speak up and not detach yourself, or be able to speak up knowing that it's uncomfortable, I find I'm a big fan of that. I think when people do that, take themselves out of their comfort zone and actually challenge the issues beyond, the fact that they are comfortable in themselves, I always find that to be useful. And that's why I say silent is complicit. It's for all of us to speak up.
Danny, I like what you said a while ago, that there are two steps here. One is the cognitive step to recognize racism and understand the origins. And then you said, then you have a choice.
Right.
And so the second step is the action. And both, of course, are important. But as long as we don't go into the action, the cognitive step is not very helpful. It doesn't change things very much.
Maybe the system needs to incentivize, the type of behaviors we want to see in society. Maybe tax reform needs to have this as part of, how do you incentivize corporations for having a diverse pool of talent? At the corporate level, how do you incentivize it in the working environment? There has to be ways that society can make diversity a positive, and one that you can actually get incentivized from.
I want to listen to our listeners again that, both of these books, Black Fatigue and How to Be an Anti-Racist, they are full of concrete examples of policies at the regional level, at the city level, at the state, on federal level, policies that need to change. So there's plenty of things we can do.
I want to take a couple of questions now from our community. And thanks to everyone who's been sending questions and comments and references. Very high level exchange here for anyone who's marginally interested in this topic. There's a great stuff here. This question comes from Grace Rogers. Can any of you suggest good examples of resources that teach the real history of humanity in engaging ways? If children were taught the story of colonialism, I think it would quickly show how misguided it was. Knowing this relatively recent history would put into perspective the wisdom that existed in the cultures of the indigenous communities who had lived harmoniously within the natural system before. So maybe that's a question for Fritjof to start. about references, good examples, literary examples.
You know, I would say, you know, definitely Ibram Kendi is an excellent reference, but it's quite a high intellectual level. His book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is not difficult to read. It's easy to read because it's also intermixed with personal stories. And I would say that would be the best reference I know. But
what about the history of humanity, broadly speaking? Does anything come to mind?
That I'm not sure.
There's an Israeli author, I can't remember his name now, that wrote a fantastic book about the history, but this is less about race.
Sapiens?
It'll come to me, I'm sorry.
Is it Sapiens?
Yes.
The Hadidi book?
Sapiens.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's what.
That's a classic.
Looking at, it's a fantastic book, but it's a great read on humanity, right? It's a great read to sort of all of us sort of humble ourselves and realize that in the end we're all humans. The point you just made about where do you start the education, I think is a really important one. I actually believe that at this point, there's an opportunity to start at the ground, from the ground up, from, you know, from kindergarten to nursery to stories being told while your child is being fed. Like, there has to be a way to introduce the truth or the story as it should be told in a way that isn't confrontational, but educational. Because I think it's such a tough subject that, you know, I'm sort of visualizing a mother or father sort of putting their kid to bed, trying to somehow, there's a book or whatever the thing is that they're using to help this child begin to understand the concept of some of these challenges that we're talking about. I personally am interested in solving for some of that myself, just from the creative space. I think there is a whole array of opportunity here to create amazing, insightful, useful educational products that are intended for children.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought of a book by a friend of mine, Jeremy Lent, who lives here in Berkeley. It's called The Patterning Instinct. And it's the history of humanity from a cognitive perspective, from a perspective of meaning making and creating patterns of meaning in various cultures. It's a brilliant book. But again, Danny, to translate that into something you can teach children is extremely important, and I don't think it has been done yet.
Yeah.
So here's a loaded question, but a very intelligent one. This is coming from Kate Gress. What is the benefit / damage of focusing on individual aspects like implicit bias and identity politics versus looking at the machine that prompts and reinforces the behaviors of racism? Doesn't it make more sense to understand racism as essential to the current economic structure? It seems elites throughout history have created and leveraged various types of difference to maintain their dominance.
Well, I think that's exactly how we began the conversation when I pointed out, Kendi's insight that racism begins with self-interest of certain groups, which then leads to discriminatory policies. And that sort of then morphs into what Kate calls the machine. And then the racist ideas are used to justify those policies. And this is why it's important, it's very important to focus on concrete policies.
Perfect. Here's a question from Robert Wilson, a dear friend of ours. He wants to bring Brazil into the discussion, perhaps as a key point of juxtaposition in the structure of racism in the USA. And while I'm not an authority on the topic from a comparative perspective, perhaps there are some data points here that I can offer about the Brazilian experience with systemic racism for the benefit of our viewers who are not from here. So Brazil endured 400 years of slavery, and only 132 years since the abolition of slavery. So we're still kind of learning the ropes. Racism here, it's so systemic that people of color, while they represent a majority of our country's population, they're referred to as minorities. So you can see kind of the incoherence in that. Of the total homicides of youth in Brazil, 75% of victims are youth of color. In fact, every 23 minutes, a Black youth is killed. And of all Brazilians in extreme poverty, 65% are people of color. Blacks in Brazil make 60% less than whites. And if we don't break this vicious cycle, it's going to take approximately 127 years to achieve salary parity between whites and blacks. And again, almost 56% of our population are people of color. So the majority is black or brown. And yet we only have 17% of people of color in Congress, and only 4.7% of leaders in Brazil's 500 largest companies being people of color. So we have a long, long way to go here in Brazil. Do you guys want to comment on that, or can we go to the next question?
This is really stunning because in the world at large, Brazil is often admired for its racial diversity and tolerance, and you know, what we see from Brazil is not so much the inner workings of the corporations and the politics, but it's the singers and artists and footballers, and you know, many of those are people of color, and we admire them, you know, from Pelé down, you know, to you know, the creators of bossa nova and all the Brazilian things we love around the world. And so it's often held up as a country of great diversity and great tolerance, but apparently it's not that.
Yeah, I think you've articulated really well. It's funny because I spent a lot of time in Brazil, and I think you, from the outside, you won't feel it, because you know, there are these iconic cultural icons that we all admire, from music, you just said it, you know, to athletes. But when you're on the ground in Brazil, you do feel the disparity, you know, and it's back to what you said earlier. It's a classist. It's to do with income, you know, it's to do with wealth, it's to do with education. And you can see it, you can actually see it. Now, I was very fortunate. My experience, thankfully, of Brazil wasn't that. My experience of Brazil was that of a privileged a white privileged, you know, businessman. You know, lucky me. But for the large majority of people living in like the favelas and, you know, places around, you know, Rio, there was a really sharp contrast between the haves and have-nots. And it was usually tied to race. You quickly saw it. And so you're right, the rest of the world won't see it. It's almost normalized. It's almost, right, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lourenço, but it almost felt as if, you know, it's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. You know, it's just the way it's always been. And I think where we are now is we're saying, no, that's not the way it's always been. That's the miseducation that we need to break. You know,
I want to ask also, I should add that I've been to Brazil a lot too, and I've had the same experiences. I was not talking about my personal experience, but of sort of just, you know, the world at large, how people see Brazil. But I want to ask you, Lourenço, after Black Lives Matter, what's the impact in Brazil of Black Lives Matter?
Well, I think it trickles down globally, and it definitely, in a way, propelled a number of different conversations that were already existing here in Brazil. But it comes in different colors and in different through different lenses. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we had the founder and CEO of a big bank do an interview on a TV show, and she was asked about diversity and inclusion in the high levels of the organization, and she responded that, you know, she has a lot of trouble finding top talent, diverse talent for those positions, and she insinuated, and she was explicit about this, that she'd have to level down the prerequisites and the requirements for those positions in order to have a more diverse leadership. And the whole country kind of took a stand against what she said, and it was a very revelational moment of systemic racism, because I'm sure she's a wonderful person with the best intentions, but it's that stereotype which is ingrained. It's the unconscious bias. It's the blind spot, and it comes across. You don't even realize the implications of what you're saying. And you know, social networks kind of took this up. It became the biggest trending topic, which I see as, you know, progress. If the country is starting to have a national conversation about these issues, then it kind of shows that there's critical mass around these things. So you have Black Lives Matter in the US, you have, all our own personal agendas here in Brazil, but they start kind of connecting and interweaving. And then we start getting to where we need to get to, which is
of course,
the majority of people pushing this agenda forward.
Again, it's the same with sexism, I have been invited over the last 30 years, I've been invited to countless all-male panels, and I would say, I'm not going to do it unless you invite women. And then they would say, oh, we want to, but it's so difficult to find qualified women, And then I would give them a list of a dozen highly qualified women, who are, professors, researchers,
Yeah, it's a good excuse, and you have to remember that formula has worked for them for years. The excuse has always been, well, the talent pool isn't there. Well, I'm living proof that's obviously a contradiction. That's not true. But I think to your point, Lourenço, and I love this, the fact that people are pushing back tells you there's a shift that's happening. There's definitely critical mass, and the idea that we push against some of the stereotypes collectively is how you're going to change, the popular.
And again, where we started, to come back to where we started, Kamala Harris in the White House will be a huge influence. I mean, this will go around the world,
Yeah, and it's yeah, you're right. I mean, you said it right. In less than 1 week, we went from, potentially being led by what, for all intents and purposes, are racist. Now we have we're about to have a very diverse government that will.
I think it was dramatic. Remember how we went to bed on election night, thinking that everything is lost, and then woke up the next morning.
Yeah, and it's great to see that in this instance, good won. For me, my wife was saying, gosh, you should be celebrating. You should be really happy. And I said, yes, I'm absolutely. I love the fact that this has happened. But for me, day one, I saw that as, okay, now the real work begins, right? Now we've done the hard work of getting you in there. Let's be as impatient about seeing change whilst you're in office as we were about seeing you get into office, and so I think the level of sort of focus and aggression in terms of pushing some of these policies through is going to be a real challenge, but it's one we have to continue doing in order to see real change. I believe we will see change. I believe we're seeing it now. I believe these dialogues are a good example of what we mean. It's no longer a strange thing to have a conversation about race. That wasn't always the case. So that in itself is a huge step forward in the right direction.
And maybe Danny and Lourenço, we can also together, our little group of friends, take a second step. Who knows? Maybe we could do something together,
Yeah, I would love that.
Project,
In fact, there's a provocation here, Fritjof, from one of our viewers, Susanna Paris. She's asking whether systemic racism is going to be chapter 13 of the Capra course. So if you can maybe take this opportunity to tell people about the Capra course as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Susanna. This is a course on what I call the systems view of life, and it's based on a textbook I wrote called The Systems View of Life, together with Pierluigi Luisi, an Italian biochemist. And it is really a synthesis of a new understanding of life in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of context, a synthesis that integrates the biological dimension of life with the cognitive, the social, and the ecological dimension. And I'm now teaching this textbook as a course online, which consists of 12 lectures, and I have taught it for 5 years. And we have an alumni network of over 1,800 in 75 countries around the world. And although I don't plan to add a lecture on racism, it will certainly be a key point in our discussions, because we have a discussion forum that goes on every day during the course, and it will certainly play an important role there.
Fantastic. So as we transition into our closing remarks, I wanted to invite you, Danny, first, and then Fritjof, to leave our viewers with a bit of inspiration. Perhaps we talked a lot about learning to become anti-racist, So perhaps in whatever your remark may be, to kind of help people understand what they can do today to make one step towards becoming an anti-racist.
Well, first off, let me thank you and your extended team for putting this together. I appreciate, the fact that you said it right. You have a privileged background, and yet you took the time to, proactively invest your time and energy into doing this. So I forever am grateful for you doing that. I think besides what's happening around us and the way that we're looking at the world, I'm going to go back to the theme I started with, which is we are humans first and foremost. Everything we're talking about you can come right back down to its core essence, and you're going to end up realizing that ultimately there's a lot more. We have a lot more in common with each other than the opposite. And so for me, I think that there's a certain amount of empathy that people need to hopefully start having for this conversation. I think empathy can be a really powerful tool in this instance. I want people to see these conversations and these dialogues and these things around racism and try and put yourselves in the shoes of the recipient. Try and have a certain level of empathy to what you're seeing, even if it's not your world, because in doing that, you'll see the holes, and most people will try and fill that hole. I think it's important to continue to love one another. I think it's important to continue pushing ourselves, into uncomfortable situations where we're there in service of the dialogue. There's been times I've gone on a webinar where I don't really want to be on a webinar, but I'm going to do it because I think the subject is not this one. I was really looking forward to this. But because I think the subject matter is important. I've got 2 young, beautiful Black boys whom I want to have grow up in a world that is going to respect them, is going to give them the same amount of opportunity as anybody else, and give them the same level of access as anybody else without any fear of it being taken away from them. Those things are their rights. That's not a gift. It's not a privilege. It's theirs. And so as their father, I feel it's important for me to take a stance and take a position. But the position I'm taking is one of solutions. I want to help. And so I encourage everybody else out there to find one thing that, requires them to go out of them, to invest a piece of themselves, whether it be time, energy into this subject, and really lean in. Because I think it's only by these small, if racism is death by 1,000 cuts, well, its solution then has to live in that same space. So let's start having solutions that are death by 1,000 cuts. Those small solutions over time will compound into, I think, big results. And so if there's one takeaway that I would ask the viewers is, please find something proactively that requires you to step out your comfort zone and apply yourself. I think we can all take those small steps towards a greater good.
Thank you, Danny. Fritjof?
I want to leave you with a hopeful idea that I learned from the books I read, and that is that racist and anti-racist are not fixed identities. We can be racist in one moment in our behavior or thoughts, and anti-racist in another moment. So racism does not lie in the person, but lies in the values and ideas. And values and ideas can change. Becoming an anti-racist is a constant struggle, a struggle of recognizing racist ideas and fighting them. And that's what we have to engage in.
Thank you, Fritjof. I guess my final invitation is that we learn to be honest and humble about our own ignorance, and that we realize that unless we challenge and we overcome these false distinctions about who we are, there's really nothing to hope for moving forward. We talk about extensively climate change is an existential threat, but so is systemic racism. Eliminating it is the responsibility of this generation. So withdrawing from this conversation is never an option, which is precisely why we decided to have this very lively exchange today. So thank you, Fritjof. Thank you, Danny. Thank you to our guests all over the world. And I leave you with another quote from Ibram Kendi, who ended up being this huge inspiration for this panel without even knowing it. He says, "Let us be anti-racist. Let us defend life. Let us defend our human rights to live and live fully, because we love. And to love humanity is to drive humanity forward." And so we shall, Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.